Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erica George. I'm the Samuel D. Thurman Professor of Law at the S.J. Quinney College of Law, and I have the honor of directing the Tanner Humanities Center. I am especially honored to know Janan Graham Russell, who's looking fabulous and has even more interesting and fabulous research. Janan Graham Russell joined us from Harvard University, where she's a PhD candidate in the study of religion. Her research is situated in the fields of African Atlantic religions and spiritualities, anthropology, as well as migration studies. And the project she's done for us, for herself with us, will encapsulate that. And I'm excited for her to share it with you. She's using ethnographic and historical methods. Her dissertation examines the intersections of race, ethnicity, religious practices, and identity formation among Haitian Mormons, Haitian migrants, Haitian Mormons, Haitian Americans in the United States, investigating the role of identity in the development and maintenance of social relationships in the Mormon Church. She has had previous work featured in Mormon Feminism, Essential Writings, published in 2015, a Book of Mormons, Latter-day Saints in a Modern Zion in 2015 also, and in the Atlantic. So she's written in popular press. So she's an public intellectual and a thought leader in this space. She is currently a participant in the BYU Maxwell Institute's consultation on Latter-day Saint women in historical perspective, and acts as a 2021-2022 Mormon Studies Fellow here with us at Tanner Humanities Center. Janan also holds a master's from Harvard University in religion, and her first degree was from Howard University in divinity. This project is in process and evolving. We had a chance to workshop it with her last week. We had a very interesting and stimulating conversation, and something that I so respect about Janan and her work is she shared how it has shifted shape and changed course based on what she's learned. So she's going to talk to us today. Their paper has a new name and title. They Call Me Diaspora, Ethnoracial Identity, and the social religious capital among Haitian Mormons in Utah and in Massachusetts. Please join me in welcoming Janan. We are asking that our virtual participants please keep camera off for the quality of recording. And we will have time at the end of her presentation for questions and answers, both from those of you in the Zoom room and the actual room. Please join me in welcoming Janan Graham Russell. Welcome, and thank you for being with us this year.
Thank you so much. That I figured, because this is the first time I've been out of my house in the past couple months, I might as well just go big or go home. All right, bonsoir. Thank you so much, you all, for coming. I am especially grateful for the Tanner Humanities Center for this wonderful opportunity. Erica, Paul, Jeremy, Beth, Katie, the faculty and staff who work at the Tanner Humanities Center. You've made this this fellowship it's a really rich and rewarding experience. So I'm eternally grateful. I'm thankful for those at home who are joining us home or their offices, their garages, joining us virtually. Thank you for coming, those who are here. And last but certainly not least, I wanted to thank the participants. Thank you for sharing your stories, your lives. I'm trying to get emotional. For laughing with me, for crying with me. Zami mwen, merci, mwen espoir ou ka faye. Thank you. So the name of my discussion, let me share my screen. I forgot that I actually have a presentation to share as well. There we go. They Call Me Diaspora, Ethnoracial Identity and Social Religious Capital among Haitian Mormons in Utah and Massachusetts. And this work is sort of the culmination of 4 years, 4 of my 5 years so far, my PhD work, working with Haitian Mormons in Utah, specifically in Massachusetts when I came here, decided to expand upon that work to work with Haitian Mormons in Utah.
Just drag that.
Yeah, let me drag this technology. I can never make fun of my mom and dad ever again.
It's looking good from the Zoom room where we sit. Awesome.
Oh, fantastic. Let's move this around. Is that better? All right, fantastic. All right, we got this. All right, so it's a quick overview of the work that I'm going to be presenting today. So I'll be first starting with my introduction, and then I'll do a quick introduction to what is diaspora exactly. Next, I'll be going into defining social gospel identity theory, and then go into questions and comments. So quickly before we begin, I wanted to go over or sort of reflect on this painting. It's a painting by a Haitian Mormon artist by the name of Henry Brazil called The Baptizing in the Waters of Mormon. And so we see sort of this more Haitian Caribbean style colors, or this vibrant colors, along with two white characters being baptized. So it's something that I want you all to keep in mind as we're thinking about sort of this hybridization, or what Haitian Mormon identity can look like within the LDS Church in Utah as well as Massachusetts. Recalling how she began her Sunday meal tradition, Kim paused. I had some Haitian kids coming over, and one of them is Dion. He used to go to a single adult ward, and then he invited a friend, and then a friend invited a friend invited a friend. She stared earnestly into the screen. As she talked about how much the tradition had grown over the past 10 years, she expressed, I can't stop it. I don't want to stop it. You don't understand what kind of blessing this thing is. Scholars who have studied religion have long considered the social fabric of religious life. But as Robert Orsi has argued, religion is a network of relationships. Lateral relationships among co-religionists, like those between Kim and the individuals who attend her weekly dinners, foster impressions of belonging through the development of resources. These resources can be economic, religious, or in the case of Kim and her guests, spiritual and social, a meal to observe the Sabbath and to honor the friendships they have cultivated over the years. The development of social relationships and the social religious capital they produce act as the focus of my dissertation project they call my Dyaspora, Ethnoracial Identity and the Development of Social Religious Capital among Haitian Mormons in Utah and Massachusetts, which analyzes the dynamics of belonging among first, 1.5 and second generation Haitian individuals who affiliate with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Using ethnographic and historical methods, I survey the structure of social relationships in Mormonism, highlighting their capacity to invoke feelings of belonging or disaffection among Haitian immigrants in the Mormon Church and in the US, and their influence on the creation of social religious capital. I define social religious capital as the social, economic, and spiritual resources that are developed and maintained in a religious community. My intervention examines how prescriptive and self-ascribed markers of identity, so for example, racial, ethnic, gender, and religious, can impact the quality and quantity of social relationships and social religious capital. I examine the role of identity in informing how individuals consider themselves to be a part of their local congregations. I evaluate where and how the boundaries of Mormon, Haitian, and American communal identities guide the exchange of social, cultural, religious, spiritual, and economic resources among Haitian members and their fellow congregants. Finally, I use diaspora alongside what I call social gospel identity theory as analytical frameworks that underscore the development of Haitian identity in the Mormon Church and the US concurrently. This paper introduces these frameworks and their role in producing social religious capital among Haitian Mormons. So for my project, my intention was to interview 35 to 50 Haitian members, or rather Haitian individuals who are affiliated with the LDS Church in Utah and Massachusetts. And I used the word affiliation specifically instead of saying current members or former members, because I think to really understand what it means to belong in the LDS Church, you have to understand, or at least listen to the stories, the narratives of those who feel like they do belong, and why those who have left, why they did not feel like they belonged, and why they did not feel a part of their communities. So a key component of developing social relationships is an understanding among individuals in a group that they share an identity. In the case of Latter-day Saints, it's a religious identity and a spiritual identity. And so I ask how different identities, racial, gender, ethnic, and sexual identities cross, blend, and blur with an LDS religious identity. So the first question, what is diaspora? Though she was born in the, sorry, my voice is not keeping up with me today. Though she was born in the US, Marie often spoke of being from Haiti, When asked why she claimed Haiti as her homeland, she explained, naturally, I don't have a choice but to be connected to Haiti because I was acculturated to be Haitian. Her comments reminded me of a passage by Martin Monroe in the introduction to his book on Haitian and Caribbean writers. Addressing what it meant to inhabit Haiti as a Haitian, he articulates, and yet if the Haitian people are unable to fully inhabit Haiti, Haiti inhabits them, troubles them, and fascinates them, whether they remain in Haiti or live in the diaspora. Thank you. In this section, I explore diaspora as a framework that illustrates the spatial, culinary, and temporal landscapes of Haitians living abroad, invoking the ways Haiti inhabits the social, economic, religious, and political lives of Haitian Mormons in the US. In her essay, Diaspora, Joanne Hoppolite details the experience of growing up Haitian in Boston. Quote, disconnected from the physical landscape of the homeland, she writes, you don't grow up with a mango tree in your yard, you don't suck canapes in the summer or sit in the dark listening to stories of Compe Bouquet and Malice, end quote. For her house in Boston is her island, a social and cultural enclave through which she experiences her Haitian identity. Though separated by miles of land and sea, Boston and Haiti are bound, quote, through the continuous circulation of people, money, goods, and information, end quote. Diaspora emphasizes Haitian identity formation in the US through the experience of living, quote, here and there at once. The past and present converge in an otherwise third space as those residing in diaspora experience Haiti with their communities and the practices that are a part of their daily lives. When asked about being Haitian, Dee was perplexed. It's just something you do, she responded. So one particular doing, so the work that I've been doing, I identified two doings. There's a lot more work to be done, but so far the first one rather is one doing involves the preparation of Haitian cuisine. Quote, I didn't know how Haitian I was until I became parents of the kids, and I'm always making Haitian food, Robin said. Food was often a topic of discussion among the people I spoke with, especially around the first of the year. January 1st marks Haitian Independence Day, commemorating Haiti's declaration of independence from France in 1804. Many Haitians enjoy soup jamu, a savory assemblage of vegetables and meat on that day. Ellen imitated a chef's kiss when describing how good soup jamu was. Quote, we do soup jamu always for an entire week and a half until it's all gone, end quote, she gushed. Then pointing her gaze towards the ceiling, she sighed as she talked about how much she missed Haitian food from her home in Jacksonville. As Edwidge Danticat explains in Diasporic Appetites and Longings, quote, food mitigates the immigration process, end quote. It's one of our strongest symbols of home, she continues, because it's our first connection to the place we were born. When we switch cultures, what we first see, our first visible change is in the food that we have to eat, end quote. Like Ellen, second-generation immigrants are introduced to ideas about home by preparing foods from their parents' country of origin. Individuals experience the here and there of diaspora with the flavors and textures that reminds one of home. From the sweetness of mangoes from a tree in the yard to the slipperiness of kalaloo as one tries to pinch it with their fingers. I explore the ways food mediates notions of Haitian identity among Haitian Mormons, analyzing how it acts as an integral part of the contours of the diaspora. As Kim's story suggests, food is the bridge between her Haitian identity with the preparation of Haitian dishes and her Mormon identity. So for the many individuals that I interviewed and others who live outside of Haiti, it is in a sense an island that one can return to through familial and communal meals. The second doing identify as language. So as we spoke, Ellen reflected on connecting to other Haitians during a summer she spent in Rexburg, Idaho. Sorry, I say Rexburg. I'm like, you guys are in Rexburg, Idaho. There she met Laura, who along with her brother started a local Haitian club. Among its activities, the club hosted a large party for its members. Though she enjoyed the festivities, she added that Laura commented on her lack of knowledge concerning Haitian Creole. Quote, she was like, I'm only going to talk to you in Haitian Creole from now on, end quote, Ellen explained. A deeper analysis of its use among Haitians illustrates a long history of language politics in and around Haiti, revealing the ethnic and class distinctions it entails. The role of Haitian Creole in public discourse has been an area of debate for many years. Though spoken by most Haitians in Haiti, the French language overshadowed Haitian Creole in public and intellectual life. Haiti considered French as, quote, linguistic capital, end quote, with the belief that knowledge of the language in some cases would be economically beneficial. Though Haitian Creole has been recognized more widely in governmental settings in Haiti and the diaspora, many Haitians in the US see it as a language one uses at home. During my interviews, those who noted that they spoke Haitian Creole added that they only used it with family and friends. One such example related to the management of Haitian identity came up during a conversation with Parker, as she commented on the experiences that encouraged her to join the BYU Haitian Club. In my eyes, there weren't very many Haitians growing up. So when I went to BYU, seeing any amount of Haitians was a lot. And so they would come to me and started speaking Creole because they recognized that I looked Haitian. And I was like, bruh, I don't speak Creole. And they're like, what? It bothered me that I didn't know my culture. I just kind of looked the part. I didn't know how to act Haitian. I didn't know how to talk Haitian. I didn't know how to cook Haitian. For younger generations of Haitian immigrants in the US, being Haitian is more than looking the part and instead connotes an identity that embraces Haitian Creole. In this, my study emphasizes the ethno-linguistics of diaspora as Haitian Mormons cross, blend, and blur the boundaries of Haitian, American, and Mormon identities. I explore the spatial dynamics of Haitian Creole used among Haitian Mormons, observing how, where, and when individuals use it. So for example, the hymnal that is shown, that's the French LDS hymns. And so in Boston, the Boston Third Ward in Roslindale, Massachusetts, all the materials that they use are in French. And so understanding the politics of these dynamics of Haitian Creole versus French, I think is another way to sort of explore the sort of cross or the intersections of Haitian, Mormon, and American identity. To rephrase Timothy Smith's famous quote, immigration to the US is a racializing process. First-generation African and Afro-Caribbean immigrants in the US must contend with a racial classification system that differs from designations in their country of origin. While this process is similar for several immigrant groups in the US, the salience of Black identity in terms of its social, political, and social historical contexts creates an immigration experience unique to people of Black African descent. How individuals navigate the system implicates the interplay between racial and ethnic identification. It is not solely a matter of which identity takes precedence, but rather a case study in the ways individuals negotiate the meaning of racial identity while retaining one's connection to their ethnic background. Dee was adamant about her connection to Black identity and how she talked about racism in the US. Quote, I mean, it's heartbreaking outside looking in, she explained. It's just heartbreaking, and we just don't know how, in general, we're all together, we're all Black, end quote. During our interview, Dee made it apparent that she identified with the political struggles of Black people in the US. At the same time, she stressed the importance of her ancestors during the Haitian Revolution in a way that locates her proximity to Black Americans. She says, quote, I think when it comes to being Haitian and an American, you do kind of see things differently when it comes to racial stuff for me. I tell myself all the time, I can sleep well at night, just a little bit, knowing that my ancestors, they shed some blood for me. That's all I can do. But I just feel like with Americans, you had to ask for that for years, and we're still asking. Dee's view underscores the complexity of a shared racial identity and accompanying consciousness among Black African individuals in the US. Though class differences occur, the belief in a shared Black racial identity has historically taken on political significance. As the Black immigrant population in the US has grown exponentially since the Hart-Celler Act of 1965, Black immigrants and their children have further diversified the American political imaginary with an assortment of ideological frameworks that inform racial meaning in the US. Quote, the meaning of being Black, who is allowed to be Black, and the content of a Black agenda is now more fiercely contested than before, Michael C. Dawson writes. Dee's story demonstrates that being Black in the US may come with a particular political awareness through experience or observation of US politics and policies. However, Black immigrants may not, quote, attach the same set of ideological and political meanings to their racial identity as do African Americans, end quote. Scholarships such as Mary Waters' analysis of first-generation West Indian immigrants, in the case of ratio-ethnic projects taken up by Afro-Caribbean immigrants in the US, involve the negotiation of one's proximity to African Americans. I asked to what extent does this translate to how Haitian individuals interpret the LDS Church's racial history, specifically as it relates to people of Black African descent? How is the story of the priesthood and temple restrictions told through a diasporic identity? I'm particularly interested in examining one's membership as a racial ethnic project, homing in on Dalika Saul's theory that Black populations in the US use religion to distinguish their ethnicity in an anti-Black society. Here I suggest that how individuals think about the previous restrictions reflects the ways Haitian individuals experience race through a number of lenses such as class, gender, nationality, and ethnicity, and create meaning from those experiences. As my interviews have demonstrated, the differences in how people approach the previous restrictions cannot be explained by one demographic alone. I explore these categories in unison to exemplify the fluidity of diasporic identity, particularly in a religious community. So I wanted to quickly, before we go to social gospel theory, I wanted to quickly read this quote. Ellen, she says, I'm grateful for her, Laura, because she's also very strong in the church, but also very strong in her cultural background. She has taught me how to love my Haitian side and not just push it off because I'm a member of the church. So she's really taught me how to be Haitian in LDS. Alongside racial identity, Haitian Mormons must contend with the bright and blurry boundaries between Haitian and LDS identity in the US. Religion serves as a critical component of the integration of immigrants, whose experiences may differ. This section reflects on the questions underscoring Mormon identity, development, and maintenance. As Charles L. Cohen notes, quote, the identity of any self-selecting group depends on the attributes conferred, or on what attributes members confer and how rigorously insiders patrol their boundaries against outsiders, end quote. The identity work conducted by Mormon Church over the past 192 years consists of the aggregation of codes, norms, and behaviors that evoke Mormonism's elaborate theological network. I use social gospel identity theory to note how Mormons engage with doctrines and policies to establish their religious identity. Members of the Mormon Church know they are Mormons in name and further by incorporating several embodied practices embedded in Mormonism's theological-based policies. So when I talk about social gospel identity, I'm thinking about how LDS theology, culture, norms, and collective identity intertwine. The management of this identity is a process. A shared sense of we extends from exchanging norms among individuals in the group. These norms, which I explore in more detail later on in this presentation, dictate behaviors that designate individuals as part of the group while simultaneously classifying others as outsiders. I consider the labor and work of collective identity formation as I develop social gospel identity theory. In identity work as group process, Schwab and Mason Schrock provide a comprehensive analysis of a group's individual or collective efforts to give meaning to themselves or others. I focus specifically on their analysis of cultural identity work as a cornerstone for social gospel identity. In their four-part definition, the authors describe the components of subcultural identity work as defining, coding, affirming, and policing. There is considerable overlap regarding defining, coding, affirming, and policing identity. My process for constructing social gospel identity theory engages the social cultural practices that are rooted in interpretations of Mormonism's theological claims. I analyze the debates around the use of the term Mormon and Latter-day Saints as defining, the implementation of guidelines concerning the consumption of meals and drinks as coding, collaborative practices and ritualized quote-unquote doing, such as the performance of rites and ordinances as affirming, and interpersonal as well as institutional level moderation as policing. Subcultural identity work begins with creating a quote symbol, image, or name that represents in more than one mind a group of people. The dialogues involving the term Mormon as a descriptor for members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints evoke the faith community's efforts to obtain and retain social, political, and religious legibility in the US. The debates around the naming have been a subject of discord since the 1830s. Organized as, quote, the Church of Christ in 1830, the religious movement would change its name several times during the following decade. In 1838, it would be recognized as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints among its leaders and laity. Yet its members spent a significant portion of their early decades in the shadow of popular media that depicted Mormonism as a useful counter-image of what America shouldn't be. Critics deem Mormons un-American because they practice plural marriage, communitarianism, and the theocratic structure of its governmental entities. Outside groups associated Mormons alongside reported, quote, problem groups, end quote, in the 19th century, such as Black individuals and Native Americans. Mormon and the related term Mormonite became pejoratives used in media and public rhetoric. Still, as Jan Ships adds, not all saints were dismayed by the term. Many saints adopted the name as an alternative designation, with some scholars noting the title as an abbreviation of Mormonite. Ships attests that the reclamation of the term Mormon reflected the saints' acceptance of the Book of Mormon as an additional testament of Christ's life. Over the past 20 years, the Mormon Church has incorporated the use of digital space to engage discussions regarding its otherness. Mormon Church leaders have encouraged the use of social media, specifically to enter conversations regarding their beliefs. The Mormon Church debuted one such effort under the administration of the late Mormon Church President Thomas S. Monson. In 2011, the institution launched the I'm a Mormon campaign, a multi-million-dollar ad effort that incorporated the use of billboards, online profiles, as well as television spots. I don't know if any of you saw the Book of Mormon. They put an ad that was really clever, actually. I didn't see the Book of Mormon. There's a lot of going on in that play. But I heard about it. Through a process of re-signifying the word Mormon, the campaign reintroduced the Mormon Church to the US as a multifaceted faith community. Reactions to it were mixed, with many noting the homogeneity in their portrayals of Mormon life. In her study of the campaign, Marie-Therese Mader explained that the ads contained 4 core elements. Family life is central to the subject's life, the absence of discussion on Mormon beliefs, emphasizing participants as, quote, products to be sold, end quote, and the lack of a debate on unhappiness or personal struggles. However, the interest in celebrating the term Mormon diminished following Monson's passing. Under the tenure of current President Russell M. Nelson, the church community has seen a greater emphasis on using Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as its official moniker. The quote correction echoed an earlier effort in 2001 when LDS church leaders asked members to use the church's official title. The recent changes not only took an aesthetic turn, as we see with the logo on the bottom, it took an aesthetic turn through the introduction of a symbol featuring Jesus the Christ, but also further affirmed its theological claims concerning its Christianness. As Nelson commented on the problems with using Mormon instead of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, he remarked, when we discard the Savior's name, we are subtly disregarding all that Jesus Christ did for us, even his atonement, end quote. The greater emphasis on Jesus the Christ in describing the objectives of the Mormon Church is a part of defining that involves instilling an identity with meaning. The central role of Jesus the Christ in Mormonism, accentuated through text and the use of symbols, imbues Mormon identity with a Christian meaning. Beyond serving as a part of an intercommunal theological dialogue, the correction holds social, political, and social historical weight as the Mormon Church has battled skepticism concerning its Christian status in the 19th and 20th centuries. In particular, the doctrines and practices of the Mormon Church became a point of conflict during the congressional proceedings concerning the seating of Utah Senator-elect Reed Smoot in the early 20th century. Over 4 years, the hearings took on a, quote, evangelical crusade tone, end quote, as Congress saw Smoot as a threat to the, quote, government's traditional Protestant hegemony, end quote. Perceptions of Mormonism's religious claims would cross into what it meant to be American. These concerns would continue throughout the 20th century as commentators often refer to Mormonism as a cult. Even as Mormons blended into the mainstream in the second half of the 20th century, white evangelical Christians remained as some of their most ardent critics. As Mormons aligned with conservative evangelical Christians on several social issues, such as the debates concerning the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, evangelicals persisted in their suspicion of Mormonism's Christian label. In an interview with Albert Mohler, a prominent evangelical Christian leader, he explains, quote, on many of the current issues of white hot controversy in the US, evangelical Christians find themselves in common terrain in the culture with Mormons. end quote. However, he is cautious about declaring Mormons as denominational kin. Quote, should we consider the Mormon Church, or the church known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as a Christian denomination? He asks. No, we should not. It simply fails every major test of Christian orthodoxy, end quote. As Jan Ships adds, quote, while few Americans continue to think of the saints as foreign or as even as strange, they were still other. However exemplary they might be, they were not quite us. I trace the patterns of change and continuity regarding the name of the Mormon Church in the context of the community's struggle for recognition and legitimacy in the US's religiously pluralistic landscape. Here I weigh the exchange of internal and external dialogues about Mormon or Latter-day Saint identity, alongside discussions about what it means to be Christian in America and American in the US. What can the development of the theology and the religious practices of an American church community tell us about the efforts to belong in the US? Does belonging to the Mormon Church inform the Americanness of immigrant groups? Specifically, how do these discourses impact perceptions of Americanness among Haitian Mormons? I intend to explore these questions as I consider how Haitian Mormons traverse the racial, ethnic, and religious definitions of what white Anglo-Saxon Protestants have historically described as being American. James was adamant about the dietary practices that he did and did not follow. Yes, this was a fun find in the improvement era. They always have some gems in there. As a member of the Mormon Church, quote, I don't drink coffee, I do drink alcohol here and there, he noted. For most Mormons who remain quote unquote active, membership in the Mormon Church includes the recognition of several codes concerning personal dietary and sexual abstinence practices. While one's interpretation of and commitment to these guidelines vary, Mormons generally can understand that their membership involves a level of compliance to these policies. In this next section, I outline how members signify being Mormon through the practice of guidelines concerning the consumption of alcohol, tea, and coffee. Though this word of wisdom guides the moderation of fruits, grains, and meat in one's diet, policies about drinking alcohol and quote unquote hot drinks have emerged as a prominent issue in the effort to maintain Mormon identity. Several letters, journals, and newspaper articles from the 19th century illustrate that early members of the Mormon Church interpreted the word of wisdom rather loosely. Some early saints used alcohol and tea for medicinal purposes, while others drank wine on occasion without facing discipline from church leaders. Church leaders also consider the word of wisdom through a sort of an ease lens. In a letter written in 1886, then president of the church, Mormon Church rather, John Taylor, reflected on its enforcement. There are many cases where people may violate the strict letter of the word of wisdom and yet be following its spirit in doing so. To say that aged people who have been accustomed to the use of tea and coffee in early life and who feel in their old age they need beverages of this character shall not receive the blessings of the house of the Lord is going beyond that which we think proper. While church leaders could expel members for, quote, excessive drunkenness, end quote, research concerning disciplinary measures regarding the word of wisdom showed that church leaders who implemented corrective actions against members who violated the word of wisdom were often a result of accompanying infractions. Though some of these inconsistencies followed Mormonism into the 20th century, the period also saw Mormon church leaders take more stringent measures to enforce the word of wisdom. These measures included restrictions from Mormon temple and missionary work. But what had once been understood as encouragement for health and good living, writes Colleen McDaniel, yes, take a bow, became a sign of Mormon identity, end quote. For example, among Mormon men, this identity was encapsulated in an ideal that, quote, portrayed a Mormon man as an obedient follower who abstained from alcohol and tobacco, married one woman, and entered into a career in which he would excel, end quote. Today, the word of wisdom continues to have a profound impact on how Mormons portray themselves and understand connections to the religious community. And so I wanted to show this picture because I'm thinking through the ways that members have sort of thought through or sort of strategized the lack of access to coffee, but have sort of wanted to participate in sort of the social aspect. And so we see here by these 4 men who are drinking some sort of concoction. I hope it's safe. I'm not sure. But I was thinking about, as I've lived in Utah, I make a joke with my advisor that, you know, it's new for me to live in a place where everything is data. And one thing that came up was there's a coffee shop that doesn't sell coffee, but it's like, it's a taste of coffee, but it's not coffee. So I'm really interested in the ways that people sort of navigate the word of wisdom and affirming their Mormon identity, that they're affirming a Mormon identity by saying that we're not going to be drinking coffee, but we're going to drink or consume things that may or may not be somewhat related to what coffee is. The regulations of coffee and tea can pose a challenge for some Haitian Mormons who navigate the codes of the religious community alongside other traditions, particularly those regarding healing. So talking about remedies for illnesses, Ellen comments, Haitian remedies really do work. And when I was back home, sick, and mom was like, here, drink some coffee with some Vicks. Look, mom, that does not sound appetizing in Vicks. You're not supposed to digest it, you should just drink it. So I drank it and I actually felt really better. And like, I still use the remedies you've known in your youth with different teas and stuff, but also like you can also utilize blessings. So one thing that I intend to do is to see how Haitian members negotiate the word of wisdom, specifically in terms of sort of traditional practices, such as drinking coffee, because a couple of people talked about how in the mornings that their parents, or they would drink coffee in the morning, or the use of teas for medicinal purposes. The performance of Mormon religious practices highlights a liturgical network that is replete with allusions to the eternal nature of familial and extrafamilial connections. The development of this network has been well documented in religious studies. I instead direct my inquiry towards the ways practices in Mormonism can both reify and undermine perceptions of one's membership in the LDS Church. Religious practices provide individuals the opportunity to, quote, signify in order to claim an identity. The work of signification is not done in isolation, but rather through social interaction. Using the example of temple work and wearing garments, I observed the relational aspect of doing Mormonism. The cultural, theological, and historical significance of garments is enmeshed in demonstrations of identity and loyalty to the Mormon faith. One receives their garments after participating in an endowment ceremony that takes place in a Mormon temple. As a rite of passage, wearing garments and participating in endowment ceremonies has temporal and eschatological implications. The choice to discontinue wearing garments can signify to others in the community that one no longer believes in the precepts of the Mormon Church. While I don't ask participants whether they wear temple garments, I'm interested in their participation in temple rites such as the endowment ceremony. One's involvement in the endowment insinuates that at some point the individual has received, quote unquote, their temple garments. Additionally, the practices indicate a strong level of commitment to the LDS faith, as exemplified by the covenants one makes upon first receiving their temple garments. These covenants imbue them with additional meaning. What Latter-day Saints filled with faith wear the garment and wear it properly, Carlos E. Aside writes, not because someone is policing their actions, but because they understand the virtues of the sacred clothing. Temple work, and as a collective practice, affirms temple garments as a symbol of Mormon identity. Conversely, wearing temple garments confirms the need for temple work. I seek to study how collective rituals like the endowment can instill a sense of community. Additionally, I intend to explore feelings of disaffection, which I suppose can materialize when, one, there are no opportunities to signify one's identity, or the opportunities to affirm are marred by negative experiences such as racism, sexism, misogyny, misogynoir, and homophobia. James noted, quote, I guess I'm not as active now because of issues with people of color or how the church talked about people of color, and also in terms of your sexuality. I think the reason why I would go back to church, but I'm just nervous because obviously my sexual preference, that's going to be a huge issue. Like James, a few participants conceded that their reasons for pausing their membership or leaving the Mormon Church entirely arose from situations where they encountered beliefs that undermine their race, gender, or sexuality. I aim to establish how racial, gender, and sexual identity contextualize opportunities to affirm one's Mormon identity among Haitian Mormons. Last and certainly not least, policing. I'm trying to think of maybe, because policing is a very specific image that comes up, so I'll be thinking about that a little bit more. But I suggest that the various components of social gospel identity, measures to code, define, and affirm this identity, are strengthened by a complex network of implicit and explicit norms. The Mormon Church and its members, I argue, engage in translating, coding, and decoding these norms through social interactions and congregational settings. In these settings, we see the promotion of interdependent social ties among members through a shared sense of identity. Individuals then negotiate the terms of the self within the context of this identity. Norms consist of several categories and subcategories. For this presentation, I focus on perceived and collective norms. Perceived norms break down into two subcategories: descriptive, which denotes an individual's interpretation of the strength and prevalence of behaviors, and injunctive norms, which measure how individuals feel obligated to follow a specific standard or set of models. Collective norms do not exist as an assemblage of individual perceived norms, but rather they serve as a, quote, aggregation of individuals' behaviors, end quote. The perception of these behaviors by individuals can determine its normative status. For example, the high prevalence of Mormon temple attendance in a congregation would imply that it is a collective norm for that community. The violation of norms can result in a type of sanction from the group, guided by the belief that behaviors determined as deviant can threaten group identity. The apprehension concerning the potential deviation from communal norms is enough to shape ideas about how individuals identify themselves. For example, let's see, we'll come back to that real quick. For example, I can say that the church is very accommodating. Mormonism is that there's so many programs and opportunities for you to grow as a member. Now I can go to the slide. You have access to education, access to food, access to money, access to community. But with that access comes the decision on whether you'd like to compromise your identity to a degree, depending on who you are. I assess the degree to which Haitian members contend with religious norms in the Mormon Church to feel a part of their congregations and the institution more broadly. These internal and external dialogues implicate a number of social and cultural dynamics that intertwine with perceptions of race, ethnicity, and gender. Dee recalled an experience with a volunteer who had come to support prospective BYU Idaho students at her Haitian Creole ward in Rosendale, Massachusetts. So imagine you have a room, he's white, he's preparing us, and he was saying how just to prepare to be a little more modest when you go to BYU Idaho. Like the high heels wouldn't really go too well at school, and that's what he was telling us. So for a little bit of background, there was an instructor who came in to help these students, the prospective students, apply to BYU, and this exchange occurred. The moment was a harrowing one as she relayed her discomfort concerning a comment made by a, quote, white man looking at these Black girls, end quote. His words further unsettled her when she attended BYU Idaho and saw that others did not follow those clothing standards. Quote, it was just more like you're more sexual than you should be at your age, end quote, Dee added. Prepare to be modest when you go to BYU Idaho, when that wasn't the case, you know. Descriptive norms concerning clothing choices can encourage certain behaviors and at the same time can also invoke racist and sexist discourses regarding Black women and girls. How Black women present themselves is a result of the, quote, mediation of historical class and color codes that are based upon and understood primarily within the context of what's visible, one's phenotype and appearance, end quote. For Black Haitian women and girls in the Mormon Church, I suggest one's membership involves a series of negotiations that engage, quote, historical class and color codes, end quote. This process, what Pierre Bourdieu refers to as distinction, is an attempt to stave off perceptions of difference. Haitian members incorporate many strategies to, quote unquote, talk back to perceptions of difference, such as Dee's use of the oppositional gaze, in which one may, quote, interrogate the gaze of the other, but also look back, naming what we see. So this next section I'll quickly go through so we can have time for some questions. This material and spiritual material support provided by the Mormon Church instills a sense of belonging. Describing his relationship with the former youth leader, James concedes, like, honestly, the church is where that, like, if you are struggling, if you're going through difficulties in life, they are there. It's like a family. It's like they are family members. I trace the strength of social relationships between Haitian members and members of their communities through the collection of social religious capital, broadly defined as the resources available to a religious community through the creation and maintenance of social bonds. This capital can be religious, such as knowledge and a familiarity with church ritual and doctrine. It can also be economic. Continuing our conversation about James's former youth leader, he explains, quote, he's connected me with so many great people because I've told him that I'm like job searching, and he never forgot about me. and he plugged me in with some people. James notes that Mormons are apt at becoming very successful business leaders. Quote, half of the men either go to BYU or they don't go to BYU. They'll get their master's from an Ivy League institution, and then they'll run off and become chief of this or CEO of that, end quote. Though the numbers may vary slightly regarding gender and location, members of the Mormon Church are significantly more likely to have a college education compared to the rest of the US population. While being or becoming Mormon will not automatically translate to going to college or nor becoming financially successful, as Marie indicates, the Mormon Church provides, quote, access to an education, emphasizing the pursuit of knowledge as a spiritual mandate. Higher education rates offer the opportunities for Mormons, particularly men, to access a wide range of networks that may bolster their employment chances. In my project, I gauge one's access to these networks by inquiring about the types of support Haitian members receive from others. Along with providing access to employment opportunities, the act of care can demonstrate one's inclusion in a community. Ella notes, I think in my immediate community, like within the groups I'm in, they're very accommodating and they really care about your social health. And if you feel like if you don't want to be social today, they'll say, well, let us know, and so on and so forth. Identity-based relationships between givers and recipients encourage the development of systems of support such as, quote, giving, receiving, and interpreting help in various forms, end quote. Ellen is considered a part of the group because of the extension of social support. At the same time, Ellen recognizes her belongingness or the salience of the identity through the strength of the support given. I observe the dialogic relationship between giving and receiving support as individuals recognize themselves as a part of a larger group. Also, activities, quotes such as prayer, rituals, miracles, and mystical experiences build up over a lifetime, affirming one's commitment to a religion and its culture. One's, quote, investment into the community can determine access to social, emotional, and financial support. I examine how forming social relationships and social religious capital requires a degree of, quote, spiritual mastery of a religious community's tenets. I trace the material and spiritual material investments that necessitate the mastery of Mormonism among Haitian members. For example, I consider the time one spends attending church services. Attending church creates opportunities for the types of social interactions that undergird the production of social support. I determine the parameters of this exchange and the extent to which identity informs social interactions. So to conclude, the Mormon Church has broadened its social religious network as it has positioned itself as both an American-based faith and global institution. Whether Haitian members of the Mormon Church can access this network and what that access looks like and the social religious capital it produces involves the negotiation of several racial, ethnic, gender, class, and religious identities. My dissertation explores the malleability of racial, gender, and religious identities and how they contribute to feelings of belonging or disaffection in a religious minority community in the US. Though my project cannot fully encapsulate what it means to be Haitian and Mormon in Utah and Massachusetts, my objective is to present concepts that can widen dialogues about the disparate ways Haitian individuals, and more broadly Black populations in the US, worship, live in, and connect to their religious worlds. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. As is our custom, if you are done sharing screen, we'll welcome the Zoom roomers back into the room, and we will open our rooms for questions. I want to take executive prerogative and ask you or propose a comment. This is another Jananism. It's a more comment than question or combination. I saw recently that the new head of the Women's Relief Society is a woman of African descent. I don't know her ethnicity. I suppose I wanted to invite you to comment on that development. And I was struck, well, by many things in your research, but particularly the instruction to a room of Black Haitian women on how to be, how to look, how to police their body or body image, or let's say the risk of monitoring and being different from deviant from whatever an imagined norm of modesty is, or broader aesthetic when there are differences. I don't know, you've probably not been here long enough, but we had a bit of a kerfuffle about the Crown Act, which was introduced in the state legislature last year and again this year. And there are some very strong social norms around appearance that it may shade over into inclusion and who is situated where and able to do what within the faith community. And the other thing I thought that I think is your work is going to contribute so much, but I think one of the questions you'd started with was belonging, who felt they belonged, and then just as importantly, who felt they didn't belong, and why that may have led them to make other choices or even leave the faith. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for your comment. I'm glad that it's caught on like fire. You know, I can see on Twitter now, #comment. You know, I honestly, I have sort of mixed, not emotions, but sort of like responses to the calling of, I believe she's second counselor. I think that it's really important in terms of representation and those who are looking to see someone of Black African descent. There's never been a woman of Black African descent in 2022. I saw that there's some news outlets who were super excited about this news and that it was a momentous moment. And I think for a lot of people, it has been a momentous moment. But I think it also points to the work that I'm looking at in terms of ethnicity, because, and I don't want to in no way, shape, or form devalue her experiences or experiences of Caribbean immigrants, and she does identify, or she is Caribbean American. And so I think it's really important to understand that there are different experiences and contexts that help us understand what it means to be Black in the US. And so I think that should be in conversation as well, and thinking about when someone says, what does it mean to be a Black Mormon? It's not just African American. We have to think about Nigerians and Ghanaians and Haitians and Jamaicans and people from Trinidad and African Americans, and that each sort of Black ethnic group has its own story, that has its own history, and that's going to impact the way that they understand and navigate the LDS Church. In terms of sort of the thinking about the Crown Act, and especially the experience with clothing choices, I think that's such a powerful story, because in just among group chats and just talking with friends, other Black women who are either in the LDS Church or who were formerly in the LDS Church, that they've often talked about experiences where that they've been hypersexualized because it's wearing red lipstick or wearing a tight dress or wearing shoes. And there are these sort of cultural norms when it comes to quote unquote modesty or modest dress. But there's another layer, I think, of misogynoir, which is sort of the specialized hatred of Black women, and sexism and racism that comes into play when talking about the clothing choices of Black women, especially in congregational settings. So I think, especially when we're thinking about cultural norms or doctrinal norms in terms of dress, understanding the ways in which race and sexism and really class work together to shape sort of how Black Haitian women and Black women in the LDS Church are understood and sort of thought of. Thank you. Hey, Erica, you muted.
I was giving all these instructions about, so I was turning over to Jeremy Rosen, who is going to moderate in the actual room. He's the Associate Director for Faculty for the Tanner Humanities Center. I will continue to keep an eye on the Zoom room questions. And please, if you are in the Zoom room, use your hand raise function, and I will acknowledge you for a question, comment, or comment. Thank you. Okay, so now the main room is on mute. So if someone's going to come up, yep.
Hi, I'm Charnel, and thank you so much for this really wonderful presentation. I'm wondering if you could speak to the ways that Mormonism and because when you're talking about kind of Black women and the disciplinary nature of Black women's bodies, it's really reminiscent of the ways that this misogynoir plays out in kind of Mormon context, but also like Black evangelical context and white evangelical contexts. So I'm wondering if you could maybe speak to just kind of broadly kind of Christian cultures in the US. I don't know if you would feel comfortable with that. And then I'm also wondering about, I just lost my train of thought. Oh, I'm also wondering, because you've done some public scholarship, if you could think about, maybe talk about what you plan to do with this project, or if you plan to share it in kind of more public forums later on when it's finished.
Yeah. Thank you so much for taking me back to my exams. I thought it's a little triggering. No. Just kidding. In terms of sort of this broader conversation on bodies within Christianity, I mean, where do I begin? I think about Armory Griffith's work on sort of bodies and women's bodies, particularly in the moderation of women's bodies in Christianity, and sort of the absence of talking about bodies. And so it's a really interesting conversation, because on one hand, you have this like very hyper visual sort of conversation about women's bodies in evangelical, not as much Protestant, more evangelical spaces. And then there's this sort of invisibilization that happens, and sort of negation of the body, that you're here, you're present, but you need to hide yourself and parts of your body. But these parts can be seen, but these parts cannot be seen. And so I would be really interested in actually expanding that dialogue, or contributing to that dialogue. I'm not the one, I'm like, you know, really nerdy reference and like a Gandalf with my staff. But place a stake in the conversation about, or the ways that religious communities, specifically Christian religious communities, sort of mediate bodies specifically. And I think within Mormonism, it's really, I think it would really sort of support this conversation, because the concept of bodies is such a central role or central idea in Mormonism, and specifically in Mormon theology. And this idea that, you know, when people are resurrected, that they'll have perfected bodies. And then what does it mean if to have a perfected body? Is it going to be a white, are people who are Black, are they going to remain Black in the afterlife? People who are white, like, what does that look like? And unfortunately, in the history of Mormonism, it's, you look at some of the artwork, or it's what has been said, it's that people will become white, or they'll stay white in the afterlife. So I think it's a fantastic question, and something I'd like to explore further. In terms of my public scholarship, I don't know if I'm ready to get back into the land of the trolls again, but if I were to do so, my hope is to really use my work to contribute to discussions about Black religion in the United States. I think in terms of thinking about the Black church, it's often thought of as African Americans and sort of proximity to African Americans and Christianity, but really exploring dialogues about what it means to be Christian but non-Protestant or non-Catholic. But all these tools are there, that the sort of spirit of Catholicism, the spirit of Pentecostalism, Baptist churches, Methodist churches are here in this community among Haitian Mormons. And so really sort of contributing to this dialogue of quote unquote, what is the Black church in the United States in the context of sort of this exponential growth of Black immigrants since 1965.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Janan, for such an amazing presentation and awesome research. It's very relevant and meaningful, and it's been really interesting to listen to everything you've said as someone who's not from the state but has lived here for quite some time, like 11 years coming up soon, and being able to actually understand what you're saying. And you mean you gave great context, but just being able to, I know what you're saying here. Awesome. I feel like I've, acculturated very well here. And I just some person popped up into my mind when I was listening to your presentation. I wanted you to ask you about, and I wanted to see if your research has room to incorporate maybe stories from particular individuals that have reached the limelight and to launch into the public sphere and national media. And the person I thought about was Mia Love. Yeah, so a couple of years ago, She was, running for political office, and I just remember some of her campaign videos and how she kind of seems like an outlier to me, because it seems like she kind of downplayed like her, Blackness, so that she could kind of push forward or propel like the Mormon LDS kind of aspect of her to be like this LDS woman as opposed to a Black LDS woman. And I just remember some of her campaigns that seemed to be like she was the only Black person there. She'd be around a whole bunch of children who were very kind of blonde, white, blue-eyed, and she'd be hugging them, but there was no type of like kind of call for some type of like multiracial or, diverse group of people that she represented. So I just thought, was there kind of room to talk about outliers or people who might exhibit what I call like sentiments of anti-Blackness? And remember when I looked at some of her campaign videos, I kind of thought she had what I called a pick love, bed love complex. And I kind of referred back to Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye and the main character and how much anti-Blackness she kind of exhibited, and kind of saw a little bit of that in Mia Love's way of presenting herself to like not only Utah, but to the nation.
Thank you so much. It's so funny that you brought that up, because she's part of the reason why I started working with Haitian Mormons. I've always been interested in sort of the relationship between African Americans and Haiti, especially in the 19th century, how that translated to ethnography, and eventually I try to incorporate that here and there in some of the work that I do. But Mia Love has actually been a really important figure in how I'm understanding or thinking about these ideas about belonging and sort of this hybrid Haitian and Mormon identity, and sort of how individuals, people who identify themselves as Haitian, may or may not, or sort of strategize or navigate their proximity to African Americans and what it means to be Black. As I mentioned in Mary Waters' work, especially among first generation West Indian immigrants, she talks a lot about sort of how relationships between that population and white people differs than other groups because of sort of ideas about race and sort of experiences in politics and policies regarding race in their country of origin versus in the United States. And so I think I see a little bit of that in what you're talking about in terms of Mia Love, in terms of really embracing this Haitian identity that sort of steps away from being Black, because for some people, and there are people that I've interviewed who've actively tried to distance themselves from African Americans, there's this sort of social and economic status that is attached to Black identity that that is very much an idea that Black people are quote unquote at the bottom of the barrel. And so that I think there definitely is room for that, and how specifically how Mormonism, again, Mormonism can act as a racial ethnic project in sort of encouraging encouraging or fostering rather this Mormon Haitian identity, but not necessarily Black. Or if it's Black, it's not Black in the same way as African Americans. And so then again, coming back to this idea of how does that then translate to how people understand the priesthood and temple restrictions. Thank you for your comment.
So there was not a hand raised, but our former fellow in Mormon Studies, Hannah Young, sent her regards. She had to leave early, but wanted to, excuse me, thank you for this work. So I'm just relaying her sentiments. She was with us last year, knows your work well, and really enjoyed the presentation. There is a comment in the chat, another admirer, Eric Rogers, thank you for your excellent work and powerful insights. So that's it. If there are any questions from Zoom, please do raise your hands. All right, thank you, that's us.
My question had to do with the ideal and real sort of dichotomy. And I wanted to get your reflections on I think it was James, your individual who was talking about the role of networking for jobs. Mm-hmm. And this, of course, we all know, the LDS community is very good at encouraging each other, and there's a lot of networking, there's a lot of skills developed in missionary work. But to what extent does that actually turn out for Haitians? I mean, is it an ideal that is just sort of laid out there, but really is closed system for whites only, or cradle Mormons, or a certain class? Or do you actually see that this ideal is helping Haitian men to move into these relatively elite business circles?
Yeah, that's a great question, Colleen. Thank you so much. So I don't know if you heard on Zoom that her question was regarding like how this ideal translates among Haitian Mormons. It's something that I'm still trying to explore. There are instances where it is something that is very powerful, that you see the production of resources among Haitian individuals, especially like James. But I still have questions in terms of how accessible is that network in terms of race, and how people understand even gender, right, to a certain extent, and how that sort of contextualizes their experiences. So I would love to answer your question with some sort of divinity, but but even in my work, I don't know if there's ever going to be sort of an exact answer. But it's something I'm still exploring, but thank you. That's something I will definitely consider.
Very quick question.
Yes.
So I don't know that I need to come up there, or two parts. One is there an LDS presence, like a church in Haiti? Do you know by any chance? There's a temple. Is there? Okay. And I'm curious, and I know it's beyond the scope of your study, but I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts or speculation, or perhaps knowledge, whether these sorts of dynamics that you're tracking here have, play out similarly or differently? Because there's still a kind of enculturation probably that's happening, obviously in Haiti, in the LDS temple or community, right? And I'm just curious whether you know of, or you can speculate about what might be similarities or differences in this process of socio-gospel sort of identity.
So
Could I invite you to, you were doing it. I was going to invite you to repeat the question.
Yeah. No, so the question that was asked is the similarities and differences between here in the US and Haiti in terms of this idea of social gospel identity. I would say that the similarities, you would see that mostly in the Boston 3rd Ward, where it's an all Haitian Creole ward, where the leadership are Haitian Creole, or the bishopric rather, are Haitian Creole. That's a really great question. I wish my original plan was to go to Haiti actually this year, and I was not able to. So that's something I would have to, I'd be able to answer that, I think, in better detail if I were to actually go to a Haitian ward. So I will put a pin in that and I'll get back to you.
Didn't expect to know, I was just curious.
Yeah, no, thank you. But yes, and you had mentioned before, or you asked if there was a presence in Haiti, and yes, there is.
I asked them here, should I go there? Bring my notebook.
Thank you so much. I learned so much from your work, and I'm really grateful to have had a chance to learn from you. I'm curious, kind of two things. One is, and I'm not usually a numbers person, but what are the numbers of Haitian Mormons in the US, maybe Haitian Mormons in Haiti, but maybe that's outside of the scope. And then how many Haitians living in diaspora in the US are Mormon? And you may or may not know these questions, but I'm just curious, and it sort of leads to another question that I think builds from some of the conversation about thinking about this in relationship to other Black churches or the Black church in the US. And that's how much influence might Haitian Mormons or Haitian Mormon women more specifically have on the Mormon church? Because it seems you're describing these kind of ways that the Haitian Mormon women have to sort of accommodate to. Is there any possibility of the Mormon church accommodating to Haitian Mormon women's kind of requests or influence on the religion? Yeah, so hopefully that's.
Thank you for your question. Well, so far, there are about 24,000, I believe, Haitian Mormons in Haiti. The number in the US is a little harder to calculate. I'll tell you this, in Utah, there definitely aren't very many. Surprisingly, there's a significant number here. In terms of your second question, in terms of sort of the impact, I think beyond the Haitian Creole word, I don't see, at least in the interviews that I've done so far, that there's not sort of this sense of sort of this outreach to Black Haitian women. I do think of the example, and it's not necessarily Black Haitian women, but I think there was a group, it was called African Beam, started in, I think it was in Virginia. And I used this example just to think about how sort of the LDS church interacts with sort of Black immigrant groups. And there was a woman there who wanted to connect to African saints in Virginia. And so through sort of the connection she made with her bishopric and the stake presidency, that she created this group. And so, I mean, I think I see that as perhaps maybe a model that can be used for the LDS church to connect to Black Haitian women, to listen to their needs. But like anything that's direct, there's not really anything. And I think it also speaks to the issue of this kind of monolith that is created in terms of Black people, that it's like Black women versus Black Haitian women, or Black African American women, Black Nigerian women, and so on and so forth. And so, yeah, but then I still have a lot of interviews to go, so that might change. There might be an African Beam out there for Haitian immigrants or Haitian members out there. For example, Laura, or Ellen's friend Laura, she actually started this group near BYU, Idaho, or in Rexburg, and so there was a Mormon component there. But as far as the LDS church making those steps there, so far I haven't seen or heard anything.
Okay, I don't see anything in the chat here other than agreement on how interesting and powerful the insights are in the book, the book. It will be a book in the work. All right. Oh, sorry, jumping the gun. Is there anything else? Okay, then I guess from the applause I'm hearing, we are concluding. Thank you so very much. I'm waiting for my camera. There I am. Thank you so very much for your work, your time, your warmth, your witticisms, the Jananisms, the comments, all of it. Colleagues who are on Zoom and in the room, please join us. Really quick turnaround. We've got the extraordinary Professor James Campbell, who's another external fellow for us, joining us on Thursday to speak about his work and paper. He has been with us for off and on for the full year. The title is Blues for Mr. Charlie, which I think also takes off of a musical piece. But anyway, come back to learn more. It's an extraordinarily interesting paper, and we look forward to seeing you again on Thursday. Happy Tuesday. Take care. Congratulations.